in Indian Seas, 1758-9, by Alfred H. Though the great achievements of large fleets are apt to monopolize fame, it often happens in the story of our English Navy that small squadrons in out-of-the-way places show equal heroism in achieving less important results. Of such services the following are illustrations. Captain Forrest of the Augusta, having sailed from Port Royal in Jamaica in 1758, proceeded to cruise off Cape Francis, a harbour in the island of St. Domingo. He was accompanied by Captains Suckling and Langdon, commanding the Dreadnought and Edinburgh. There lay at that time at the Cape a French squadron of 4 ships of the line and 3 stout frigates, which the French commodore, piqued at seeing the coast insulted by Forrest's little squadron, reinforced with several storeships, which he mounted with cannon and supplied with seamen from the merchant vessels and with soldiers from the garrison. Thus prepared, he weighed anchor and stood out for sea. When Forrest perceived the approach of the French ships, he called his 2 captains. "Gentlemen," said he, "you know our own strength and see that of the enemy. Shall we give them battle?" Being answered in the affirmative, he bore down on the French fleet, and between 3 and 4 in the afternoon came to action. The French attacked with great impetuosity, and displayed uncommon spirit in the sight of their own coast. But after an engagement of more than 2 hours, their commodore found his ship so much shattered that he was obliged to make a signal for his frigates to tow him out of the line. The rest of the squadron followed his example, and availed themselves of the land breeze to escape in the night from the 3 British ships, which were too much damaged in their sails and rigging to pursue their victory. Captain Forrest signalized his courage in this engagement, but he displayed equal courage and still more uncommon conduct and sagacity in a subsequent adventure near the western coast of Hispaniola. Having received intelligence that there was a considerable French fleet at Port-au-Prince, a harbour on that coast, ready to sail for Europe, he proceeded from Jamaica to cruise between Hispaniola and the little island Gove. He disguised his ship with tarpaulins, hoisted Dutch colours, and in order to avoid discovery, allowed several small vessels to pass without giving them chase. The second day after his arrival in these parts he perceived a fleet of 7 sail steering to the westward. He kept from them to prevent suspicion, but at the approach of night, pursued them with all the sail he could crowd. About 10 in the evening he came up with 2 vessels of the chase, one of which fired a gun and the other sheered off. The ship which had fired no sooner discovered her enemy than she submitted. Forrest manned her with 35 of his own crew, and now perceiving 8 sail to leeward near the harbour of Petty Gove, ordered them to stand for that place, and to intercept any vessels that attempted to reach it. He himself, in the Augusta, sailed directly for the French fleet, and coming up with them by daybreak, engaged them all by turns as he could bring his guns to bear. The Solide, the Theodore, and the Marguerite returned his fire, but having soon struck their colours, they were immediately secured, and then employed in taking the other vessels, of which none had the fortune to escape. The 9 sail, which by this well-conducted stratagem had fallen into the power of one ship, and that even in the sight of their own harbours were safely conducted to Jamaica, where the sale of their rich cargoes rewarded the merit of the captors. While Forrest acquired wealth and glory by protecting the trade of Jamaica, the vigilance of Captain Tyrrell secured the English navigation to Antigua. In the month of March 1758, this enterprising and judicious commander demolished a fort on the island of Martinico and destroyed 4 privateers riding under its protection. In November of the same year, he in his own ship, the Buckingham, of 64 guns, accompanied by the Weasel sloop, commanded by Captain Bowles, discovered between the islands of Guadeloupe and Montserrat a fleet of 19 sail under convoy of the Florissant, a French man-of-war of 74 guns, and 2 frigates of which the largest carried 38, and the other 26 guns. Captain Tyrrell, regardless of the great inequality of force, immediately gave chase in the Buckingham, and the Weasel, running close to the enemy, received a whole broadside from the Florissant. Though she sustained it without much damage, Mr. Tyrrell ordered Captain Bowles to keep aloof, as his vessel could not be supposed to bear the shock of heavy metal, and he alone prepared for the engagement. The Florissant, instead of lying to for him, made a running fight with her stern chase, while the 2 frigates annoyed the Buckingham in her pursuit. At length, however, she came within pistol-shot of the Florissant, and poured in a broadside which did great execution. The salutation was returned with spirit, and the battle became close and obstinate. Mr. Tyrrell, being wounded, was obliged to leave the deck, and the command devolved upon Mr. Marshall, his first lieutenant, who fell in the arms of victory. The second lieutenant took the command, and finally silenced the enemy's fire. On board the Florissant 180 men were slain, and 300 wounded. She was so much disabled in her hull that she could hardly be kept afloat. The largest frigate received equal damage. The Buckingham had only 7 men killed and 17 dangerously wounded. She had suffered much, however, in her masts and rigging, which was the only circumstance that prevented her from adding profit to glory by making prizes of the French fleet under so powerful a convoy. In the East Indies, the French squadron was commanded by M. de Che, and the English by Admiral Pocock, who had succeeded Admiral Watson. The former was reinforced by a considerable armament under the command of General Lally, an adventurer of Irish extraction in the French service. The English admiral was also reinforced March 24, 1758, by 4 ships of the line, and, being soon after apprised of Lally's arrival, hoisted his flag on board the Yarmouth, a ship of 64 guns, and sailed in quest of the enemy. He made the height of Negapatam on March 28, and the day following discovered the enemy's fleet in the road of Fort St. David. It consisted of 8 ships of the line and a frigate, which immediately stood out to sea and formed the line of battle. Pocock's squadron consisted only of 7 ships, with which he formed the line and, bearing down upon M. de Che, began the engagement. The French commodore, having sustained a warm action for about 2 hours in which one of his largest ships was disabled, sheered off with his whole fleet. Being afterwards joined by 2 more ships of war, he again formed the line of battle to leeward. Admiral Pocock, though his own ship and several others were considerably damaged, and though 3 of his captains had misbehaved in the engagement, prepared again for the attack. But the manoeuvres of the French fleet seemed to have been intended merely to amuse him, for they neither showed lights nor gave any signal in the night, and next morning the smallest trace of them could not be observed. Admiral Pocock made various attempts to bring the French squadron to a second engagement. These, however, proved ineffectual till August 3, when he perceived the enemy's fleet, consisting of 8 ships of the line and a frigate, standing to see off the road of Pondicherry. They would have gladly eluded his pursuit, but he obtained the weather gauge and sailed down upon them in order of battle. As it was now impossible to escape without coming to action, the French prepared for the engagement and fired on the Elizabeth, which happened to be within musket shot of the ship in their van. But this spirited attack was not seconded with equal perseverance. In little more than 10 minutes after Admiral Pocock had displayed the signal for battle, M. de Che set his foresail and bore away, maintaining a running fight in a very irregular line for nearly an hour. The whole squadron immediately followed his example, and at 2 o'clock they cut away their boats, crowded sail and put before the wind. They escaped by favour of the night into the road of Pondicherry. But their fleet was so much damaged that, in the beginning of September, their commodore sailed for the Isle of Bourbon in order to refit, thus leaving the English admiral, whose squadron had always been inferior to that of the French in number of ships and men as well as in weight of metal, sovereign of the Indian seas. In the glorious 59, the French fleet under M. de Che was augmented to 11 sail of the line, besides frigates and storeships, an armament hitherto unknown in the Indian seas. The English commander, however, no sooner had intelligence of their arrival than he sailed to the coast of Coromandel, and determined to pursue and give them battle, notwithstanding the fact that the French had a superiority of 192 guns and 2,365 men, besides a great advantage in the size of their ships. On the morning of September 2, the French fleet were disgrayed from the masthead. Admiral Pocock immediately threw out the signal for a general chase, but the wind abating, he could not approach near enough to engage, though he crowded all the sail he could carry. At length they totally disappeared, and the admiral stood for Pondicherry on a supposition that they intended to sail thither. His conjecture was well founded, for on September 8 he observed them standing to the southward, and on the 10th, about 2 in the afternoon, M. de Che, seeing no possibility of escaping, made the signal for battle. The cannonading began without farther delay, and both squadrons engaged with equal impetuosity, but the French directing their cannon at the masts and rigging, while the English fired only at the hulls of the ships. The former sustained such a loss of men, and found their vessels in so shattered a condition that they were glad to sheer off with all their canvas set. The loss on the side of the English was not inconsiderable, there being 569 men killed and wounded. That on the side of the French must have been far greater, as their ships could hardly keep the sea, and they were obliged to make the best of their way to the island of Mauritius in order to be refitted. Soon after this engagement, Admiral Cornish arrived from England with 4 ships of the line, and confirmed the dominion of the English over the Indian seas.